The early days with Bikram and Barkan, part 3. Part 1 I talked about when I first met Bikram. My first class was February 1981 and what it was like to take class with Bikram in the old days. Part 2 I talked about Bikram's bright side and Bikram's dark side. What it was like to take class and experience both sides of Bikram. Part 3, now I moved to Florida. I opened my very first studio in January 20th, 1983. I've talked about this before. We actually were open on January 19th, but nobody showed up.
Oh, that's too bad.
Back then, yoga was not a very popular thing. And I've also mentioned this before in my videos. That was the hardest thing I ever did, was opening a school back in the early 80s when nobody knew anything about yoga, let alone hot yoga, letting alone turning the heat on in South Florida and doing hot yoga in the summertime.
That's crazy.
It was an insane concept. I had to educate the masses. Before we continue on, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell. If you have any questions or comments, put them down below. I'm happy to get back to you. You want to learn all about hot yoga, factoids, flows, tutorials, hit the like and the subscribe button right now. So I opened in 1983. 1984 was the first time Bikram actually came to my studio. And he came pretty much every single year for the first 9-10 years. But the first time he came, he had just come back from India with Tony Sanchez. Tony Sanchez had been doing yoga about 5 years longer than I have, so he was definitely more senior than I was. And he was running Bikram's Yoga College of India in San Francisco. And I ended up going back to Los Angeles 3-4 times a year. Bikram would go to India and I would fly into Beverly Hills and teach Bikram's 4 classes a day for Bikram for free. That's what you did. But Bikram was also generous with his time as well. So when he came to South Florida, starting in 1984, he would do classes for free. And then he would do a big lecture at night talking about the subject of yoga. In my opinion, that wasn't Bikram's best format. I used to say, Bikram, you're better off not doing a lecture for 3-4 hours running off on all of these tangents, not really properly presenting a point. What Bikram would do, he would just ramble off on all these tangents. But he was much better off in a class setting. I said, talk all you want about yoga in the class setting. First of all, you have a captive audience, but second of all, it flows better and there's a better rhythm for it. That was just my opinion. But Bikram would do 3-4 hour lecture. Let me tell you about the first lecture he did. Back to the very first time Bikram comes to my school. He came with Tony Sanchez. They had just been back from India in Calcutta. Bikram had brought Tony with him. So during the lecture time, Bikram's sitting on his futon chair, and over to the left corner, at one point, Tony gets up and he starts to perform yogic postures. He pretty much went through the entire Bikram advanced class. Tony was peaking at that time. He's one of the best practitioners of Bikram yoga that I ever saw when it came to the advanced class. So as Bikram was talking, Bikram talked for about a half an hour and then Tony started demonstrating. As Tony started to demonstrate, all the attention went from Bikram over to Tony because it was so fascinating to see Tony's practice. Very dramatic, extremely advanced, things people had never seen before, especially in 1984 in this country. But the attention went from Bikram to Tony, which Bikram didn't like very much. So at one point he goes, don't applaud Tony for the postures that he's practicing. Applaud me because I'm Tony's teacher. Just like if I was doing the practice, you wouldn't applaud me, you would applaud Vishnu Ghosh. But needless to say, it definitely upset Bikram.
Don't look at him, or look at me.
Because all the attention went over to Tony. So here's an interesting story. I think you'll find it interesting. In Calcutta, Vishnu Ghosh created the yoga competitions. I know some of you have heard of them before. Bikram's wife, Rajashree, started to popularize the yoga competitions, and right now they have a whole USA championship organization, and they've been holding yoga competitions in this country since 2003. But way before that, back in the 50s, I think it was, Vishnu Ghosh started the competitions in India. Well, let's back up a little bit, reset, because a lot of people say, hold on, how could you have yoga competitions? Isn't yoga supposed to be about finding your center and connecting to the universe and creating a mind-body spiritual experience? Yes, it is. What Vishnu Ghosh did, in fact, I did a video on this years back. Check it out after you watch this video on my version of my take on the yoga competitions. In my opinion, I think they should have just been demonstrations. But Vishnu Ghosh is really coming from the bodybuilding world where they had bodybuilding competitions, so he merged the two. That's why in the yoga competitions, the first thing you do is you stand up, you turn to the side, so that the judges will evaluate the symmetry of your body proportion, which was a big thing in bodybuilding. So because of the bodybuilding competitions, it inspired Bikram Ghosh to create the yoga competitions. Now, Bikram had won the competitions 3 years in a row back when he was, I think it was 14, 15, 16, something like that. But he was very young. He won 3 years in a row. He beat all the adults. Now, Bikram's wife, Rajashree, had won the competitions 5 years in a row before Bikram even met Rajashree. Rajashree's guru wasn't Bishnu Ghosh because Bishnu Ghosh had already passed away. Rajashree's guru was a man named Das. There was actually two brothers, the two Das brothers, and they took over the Yoga College of India in Calcutta after Bishnu Ghosh passed away. Now remember I said that Bikram and Tony had just come back from India. So while they were in India, this is back in 1984, while they were in India, and Rajashree had already won the competitions now 5 years in a row, Bikram talked to one of the Das brothers, Rajashree's guru, and said, if there was a competition, and he saw Tony do all this yogic asanas back in India, and Bikram says, if there was a competition between Rajashree and Tony, who would have won? And Das said to Bikram, according to Bikram, this is interesting to point, Das said to Bikram that if Rajashree and Tony had a competition, Tony would have won in a score of 10-1, whatever that score even means. So, according to Bikram, Das said that Tony would have beat Rajashree in the competitions, even though there was never a competition. And Rajashree was not present during that conversation. They hadn't even met yet. Now we skip ahead a year later. Bikram and Rajashree become married. Now Bikram comes to my studios. He stayed at my house every year with his wife, Rajashree. I just remember one part of the story that I forgot to tell you, which is absolutely important. Back in 1984, when Bikram was lecturing and Tony was doing his yoga off in the corner, Bikram told the group on video recording that Rajashree and Tony actually had a competition when they were in India, and Tony beat the Indian champion Rajashree at a score to 10-1. Bikram tended to exaggerate. There never was a competition. Das said if there were, according to Bikram, if there were a competition, Tony would have won. But he announced to the entire group in 1984 that there was a competition, and Tony won 10-1. Now we skip ahead a year later. 1985, it might have been 1986, I'm not sure. Bikram and Rajashree came to Florida to visit, and during one class, Rajashree decided to stay back at the apartment I was living at, where Bikram and I went to teach. During that time, we had a video recording of 1984's lecture, and you can see where this is going, and Tony's demonstration. So Rajashree is watching the videotape of Bikram saying that there was a competition between Tony and Rajashree, and Tony won the score of 10-1.
You've got to be kidding me.
Well, Rajashree was very upset because number one, there was never a competition. Number two, she never even knew that conversation took place. So now Bikram and I come back from teaching, and all of a sudden he comes into the room where they were sleeping, and then Rajashree, talking in Bengali in a very upset tone, letting him know that he lied. There was never a competition. She was very upset, slammed the door. Bikram had to sleep on the couch that night. So now as we move on to the late 1980s, I started to go on television, the local Miami Channel 7, WSVN Channel 7, and I would bring various doctors with me talking about the benefits of hot yoga, the benefits of Bikram yoga. I had an allergist come one time. I had my son's pediatrician come. We had a whole bunch of kids, and we talked about kids yoga. I had an addictionologist come from Mount Sinai in Miami and talk about how wonderful yoga is for people that are in recovery. A few times, I brought Bikram on to the television station with me. The first time Bikram actually was being interviewed, and Rajashree and I were doing yoga off to the side. We were demonstrating the yogic postures. Somebody posted that on YouTube. You can watch it. I'll put down the link in the description below. So Bikram was lecturing, and Rajashree and I were doing the yogic postures. And then at the very end, we did standing bow. And we were both looking at each other, and both of us can straighten our leg in standing bow. And there was no mirror. She's looking at me, I was looking at her, and we straightened our leg both at the same time, on cue, without any mirrors, on cue, on live television. Now, interestingly enough, they had cut that part out. It was the very end of the video, so if you do watch that video, you won't see it because they had actually cut it out. And then a couple years later, I brought Bikram and Rajashree back onto the television show, and this time the commentator was interviewing both Bikram and I.
A couple of days ago, Yogi Bikram Chowdhury dropped in along with Yogi Jimmy Barkan.
We talked about Bikram's hard heart in yoga class, sitting on a television set. You're a slave driver. Really?
You have to be. You have to be.
And Rajashree was demonstrating the advanced poses. Here's a little clip of Rajashree in one of her most advanced positions. She had an astounding practice, as you can see. The commentators afterwards were like perplexed to see how extremely flexible and strong Rajashree was in her practice. And I'd go back to LA when Bikram would go to India and I'd take over his class. However, people really didn't like when I took over his class because they were addicted to Bikram's personality. The same thing happened when Bikram would come to Florida. He would teach, and after he would leave, people would say, oh, you're such a better teacher than Bikram. It's not that I was better or that Bikram was better, it's that the people get attached to personalities. You get attached to who your teacher is. It also depends on the focus. For example, I remember one year I went to Los Angeles, had to be in the late 80s, with my #1 student at the time. Her name was Meryl. She was really extraordinary at yoga. She could go on vacation, come back 2 weeks later, straighten her leg in the standing bow in the first second of the first set, which is ridiculous to me because I wasn't able to straighten my leg in the old days until the second set of the second class. But she was very talented. So we come to the class and Bikram loves the advanced people. That's one of his passions. So he's riding her, he's getting her to do this, he's getting her to do that. He's pushing her and he's pushing her and he's correcting and encouraging. And after the class, she was wiped. She said, that was the hardest class I've done in years. Skip ahead, the same afternoon, I'm teaching and one of Bikram's students is in the middle of the class and I start to correct and guide this person and correcting and encouraging, correcting and encouraging. At the end of the class, he comes to me and says, that was the hardest class I've done in years. So where your focus is. That being said, one of my favorite things about understanding your own practice in yoga, when you're feeling really strong and really powerful that you can do anything, those are the days you have to back off because your body is going to be more resistant because you're stronger. So if you start pushing when you're feeling strong, your body's going to resist it, and that's when you can injure yourself. That's when I have injured myself in the past when I've really strong in the beginning of the day. On the other side of the coin, when you're feeling a little tired, you're feeling a little fatigued, that's when you can push it because now your body won't be as resistant and it will give way. You have more room for flexibility and you become more elastic. In the late 1980s up to 1994, I certified over 30 Bikram teachers. I was teaching so many classes, it was taking its toll. I needed more teachers. I also needed to expand my schedule. So Bikram granted me, I was one of the few people that Bikram allowed to certify Bikram teachers other than himself. 1994, he starts his own condensed 9-week program, and no longer was I able to certify people. So now Bikram starts to come up with the concept of his 9-week program. And one of the things that he did early on was he had people memorize a script, which is now known in the hot yoga world as the famous dialogue, even though it's not a dialogue. A dialogue is two people talking. I've talked about this on my channel before. I say, Bikram, it's not a dialogue. It's a monologue. When one person is talking, it's a monologue. People will argue, oh, it's a dialogue between you and the student and the teacher. No, no, no. If they were talking back, it would be a dialogue. Anyway, the concept was memorize the script, say what I say word for word. And that's how he started to mold his yoga teachers. Now, back in my teacher training program, which is 1981, 1982, we didn't have a script to memorize. So what we did, we calculated our own words. So the old teachers, I talked about Tony Sanchez, Emmy Cleaves, who taught me the advanced class, a guy named Rod Masterson, who eventually moved to Baton Rouge, was a senior Bikram teacher, and myself. We had to calculate our own words, however, addressing all the bullet points that are required for every single pose. So when Bikram and I split, if you want to learn why we split, check out this video after you watch this one. When I started to create the curriculum for my teacher training program, I had a different concept. I didn't want people to memorize a script word for word. I wanted them to calculate their own words. So in the next episode, Part 4, I'm going to talk about the difference between the Bikram and the Barkan teacher training programs and how I was definitely inspired by Bikram's 9-week condensed course, but how I changed it a little bit so my teachers can find their own authentic, unique voice or sound. So that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, hit the notification bell. Any questions or comments, put them down below. I'm happy to get back to you. You want to learn all about hot yoga, factoids, flows, tutorials, hit the like button and the subscribe button right now. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.